This week on Mags on Media, an exclusive one-on-one interview with South Africa's leading media entrepreneur, Koos Bekker, who's just stepped down as head of Naspers. He's predicted that print media will be extinct within the next 20 years, but also says prediction is a fool's game. Bekker took Naspers from a predominantly print-based media company to a global e-commerce and social media superpower with a market capitalization of over 554 billion rand. He says we're already starting to see wholesale changes in the way media is consumed and produced. He spoke to interviewer Chris Gibbons at the sold-out Future of Media conference in Johannesburg.
When Koos Bekker first got involved with MultiChoice in the mid-1980s, Naspers was a rather grey company run by executives who wore grey shoes and hung out with the National Party. When he stepped down as CEO earlier this year, he had turned it into a multimedia behemoth, operating in more than 130 countries, and made himself into a dollar billionaire in the process. At the heart of his strategy, a desire and an ability to operate in countries that do not speak English, and a stunning investment in a Chinese internet company called Tencent. Koos Bekker, we're looking at the future of media, but how do you see it right now in the present? Which platforms are up and which are down?
Chris, if you look at the recent past of media, all my predictions were wrong. So if you could have predicted Twitter, I certainly couldn't. Often the consumer reacts counterintuitively. I guess the best is not to try to predict the future, but just to adapt to it when it happens.
You mentioned the consumer, you have insights into the consumer, I know, because you've worked in advertising. How did you get into advertising and why?
I studied law. No one in my family had ever been in business, and I didn't even have a single business subject. And I realized that I like the field, and I went to advertising consciously to learn something about business. And I think advertising people are actually quite good in their analysis of the consumer and the nuances. My first research project in advertising was to research the gherkin. We discovered the ladies of Sea Point like it sweeter and spicier than the ladies of Newlands, which is a fundamental human insight. I respect advertising people for that subtlety of distinguishing consumer tastes. And I think it helped me later in business and media also.
So the current advertising industry, how do you see that?
I think it's globally the same. If you sit in an agency in New York, in Madison Avenue, or in Singapore, or in Ghana, your problems are exactly the same. And advertising is an interesting fraternity. It always struck me that the people are socially progressive, so they dress in the most sort of zippy way, but they're actually, as business people, quite conservative. They look at the past, so they ask, how did you do? What are your statistics over the past 12 months? And then with a delay of a further 6 months, and then we project it into the future. So advertising people are that curious bunch of guys that look as if they're preparing for the future, but their window is actually on the past. And the past in media has been a very poor predictor of the future. So if you sat there and you looked in your rear window 2004, let's say, how would you predict Facebook coming or Instagram? It's pretty impossible. So advertising has that tension that you need to rely upon data, and your only means of predicting for your client where we'll be next year is by extrapolating those data forward. Recent history tells you that's not the way the world works. The world works with leaps of invention that are often counterintuitive and certainly unexpected.
So against that background, how should a CEO of a local ad agency be contemplating his or her relationship with a media house?
I think it's pretty tough because the media houses are clueless. You know, the average media company in the world is in a pretty poor shape. A few will survive. Take newspapers. A few newspapers will make the transition from a print product to an electronic product, as the New York Times or the Washington, let's say Wall Street Journal have done, perhaps most successfully the Financial Times. In South Africa, you might have a few electronic news services, News 24 and a couple making it. But most media houses are as clueless as ad agencies.
Sorry, you say most media houses, your own included, Media 24, Naspers, clueless?
I think it's perhaps a little harsh, but approximately correct. The problem is they're grappling with existing media that still make money, a future which is uncertain and changing very rapidly, and trying to make the transition. So Media 24 itself is trying to move the print product online. But the moment you do that, you realize it's not simply a transition, it's something happens. For example, online, the consumer wants to talk back, participate more. He also wants to contribute. So when he's at an accident scene, he'd like to send you the latest details, and his pal would like to read it. It's like Facebook. The consumer generates the information and consumes it at the same time. The problem with media, they have often a prophetic mission. You have the great editor who interprets the world and tells the world what it should look like. But that's not what consumers want anymore, is they want to participate in this discussion. So for a media house to make the transition to say the consumer out there is not just a recipient of my wisdom, he's a co-creator of content. That's interesting, but it's also hard to do.
Rupert Murdoch, recently interviewed by Fortune, says print will be dead within 10 to 20 years. Do you agree?
Totally. I think the economics of print, if you take a newspaper, let's say you circulate at 100,000 copies, you have a fixed cost. As you decline 90,000, 80,000, when you hit a certain point, let's say 50,000, at that moment the business goes dead. You can't go to 40,000 because you're breaking through your cost structure. So what will happen is print products will progressively, each one after the other, reach that point and stop printing. But on the web, there'll be a new generation of news interpreters. So you will read the Financial Times in a physical copy, which I still prefer, if I can get it in my hotel. If you can't, you'll default to the web. The web will become more and more useful, interactive. It'll start anticipating my needs. And I might get to the point where I'll actually say, my hotel stocks the physical copy. Do I want that, or do I want to read it on my iPad? I think the iPad is more useful, both because the electronic side's usefulness increases all the time, and because print will hit the point at which their fixed cost cannot be reduced any further, and consequently has to stop publishing. I think in 10 to 20 years, physical print, at least newspapers, will disappear, and probably most magazines.
So digital convergence, still very much on everyone's lips, the buzz phrase. Where are the media houses heading on that? And again, what does that mean for advertisers?
Chris, I think the regrettable reality is most media houses will simply disappear. It's like most wagon makers when the car came around. They didn't progress to become car makers. They simply disappeared in the economy. And I think regrettably, most media houses will disappear. Another interesting phenomenon is that our competitors now are global. So if we as a company look at the scene, we're not thinking about Times Media or Caxton or whatever. We need to think about Google, Facebook, and these guys. Amazon in e-commerce. The same will probably happen in advertising, that the advertising fraternity will worry less about the local names. They'll more look at the global scene and say, oh, how do I play my product in this context?
You're watching an exclusive one-on-one this week with media tycoon Koos Bekker. Part 2 in a moment, when Mags on Media continues.
News that moves. ENCA.com.